Hey folks, welcome back. I am putting together this screencast to help us do a little bit more with our interpretation of linear regression. And what we're going to do in this screencast is look at how we can use results from regression output in order to predict the value of the dependent variable based on scenarios involving the independent variables. To put that another way, we might want to know if, as in the example that I'm going to use, what your level of support for torture would be as a function of, say, being a 45-year-old female if you had the lowest levels of racism versus the highest levels of racism. And those are, in fact, the very variables that we're going to use. This variable right here, this use torture 7, which is the one that is highlighted, is a 7-point variable that is discussed in some of the other videos that I've been using. But briefly, the original questionnaire that I've got asked whether or not people strongly disagreed all the way through to strongly agreed with the proposition that torture is an appropriate mechanism, both desirable and effective, in getting terrorists to talk. And so if you scored a 7, you strongly agreed that torture should be used, and if you scored a 1, you strongly disagreed that torture should be used. And we are going to be looking specifically at whether or not being female, notice that the variable is coded 1 if you're a male, 0 if you're not. And also age in years, whether or not that predicts, in combination with one other variable, whether or not you are likely to support torture or not. And the last variable that we've got is this racism index score. And you can see here I've labeled it in a way so that it's a little easier to remember later on what's going on. 4 questions were combined in the survey on which one could, 1, be strongly disagreeing with all the way through to 7, and these all corresponded to different attributes of subtle racism, which when put together in a way that is often done in the social sciences, you can create an index. So for a person who had the lowest score across all 4 questions, they would have 1 times 4, whereas people who had the highest level of racism across all 4 questions could have a high of 28. So let's get right to the regression modeling, and then we can turn our attention to some interpretation. Quickly analyze regression, linear regression. I don't want to go through the same details that I've on previous videos, so let me just say briefly that the dependent variable is where it's supposed to be, the independent variables are the ones that we've talked about, and we run the models and we can get to our results. We're not going to look at the R-squared other than to note that the model looks like it works. Down here on the variables that matter, we have the constant and we have an unstandardized coefficient. We've got our racism measure. As you can tell, it's statistically significant, and the way that we would interpret this is for every 1 point increase on this range, there is a corresponding 0.221 increase on the 7-point scale measuring support for torture. And we have age and we have male in there. Notice that the male statistic is not statistically significant. For our purposes, that doesn't matter. What the rest of this video is going to do, I'm going to put us on pause for a second so I can pull up the other screen, but what the rest of the video is going to do is going to ask us, or rather to answer the question of how do we predict a person's level of torture if we stipulate certain conditions down here. And what we're going to do in the rest of the video is we're going to compare for females who are 45. Imagine 2 females who are 45. What would their average support for terrorism be if they were at a low level of racism, in fact the lowest possible, versus the highest possible based on this particular output that we've got. So in order to do this, I'm going to flip over here, and we're going to go over just what a basic regression model is. I said I'd put you on pause, but I didn't need to. This is the basic regression formula that we use to calculate values. I know it looks right here, how shall I say, rather abstract, but let's just say quickly, y, remember the output we had? Y is the predicted level of the variable that we want to explain. So in this case, what do we think on that 7-point scale your support for terrorism would be if we took the value of the constant and we added that constant together with your variable for your first variable, or rather the coefficient, there we go, for your first variable, which was, I have to peek back and look, the first variable is racism, the second is age, and the third is male. If we took the coefficient for your racism variable and we times that times the value, and that's what the X is, the value that we want to assign for racism. So we're, in the first scenario, are going to give you the lowest score here, 4, and then we're going to repeat the whole exercise and we'll give you the highest score. Plus, now looking at the second variable's coefficient, age, and in this case, we're going to put in the age coefficient because we're going to do a comparison between low and high levels of racism. We're going to hold this constant. Now, typically when regression does something, they hold values, when they're predicting a variable, they hold every variable value, or every variable at its constant in order to predict. In other words, what they do is they say every variable at its average effect, and then they isolate the independent effect of a given variables. We're not going to do that. Because we're looking at scenarios here, we're going to take this B2 variable, or rather this, the coefficient for the second variable, which is age, and we're going to times that times 45. Now, out here, the ... the ellipses refers to the idea if we had 17 additional independent variables, we'd have 17 versions of this. In our case, we only have one more, the third variable, which is gender. In our case, we could look at the coefficient for gender. However, because the variable is 1 if you're a male and 0 if you're not, we're going to multiply it times 0. In other words, we're only going to look at females. So, flipping to the next page so we get a sense kind of about what's going on here. Again, y is the value, the dependent variable that we're predicting. A is the constant value, the intercept, whereas each of these is the unstandard coefficient value, and this is the scenario value. So moving on, we can see that the estimated score of torture approval on 1 to 7 is equal to the constant. This was that unstandardized variable for the constant, plus the coefficient for racism times whatever score we want to give it, plus, in this case it's a negative coefficient, negative 0.011 times the 45 years, plus the coefficient for male, however it's 0 because it's 1, and that will equal the level of support for torture after we know what the low and high levels are. So in the first example here, let's assume that you've got somebody who had the highest level possible for racism that you could be scored, 28. So in this case, we're going to multiply this out, and 0.221 times 28 equals, and we do the math all the way down, and we would get to 5.693. And I'll show you a little more math here in a second. Hopefully that will help to clarify that. There you go. If we, on the other hand, were to take racism, this time we're timesing it times 4. Unlike the last time where I just did it on my calculator, I scored it out. So 0.221 times 4 is 0.8884, plus, multiply this out, plus equals 1.514. So, summarizing here, if we were to take the typical female, because it's 0, the typical female who's 45 years old, who has the lowest level of racism, their level of support for torture on average and controlling for those other variables would be 1.514 on a 7-point scale. On the other hand, go back up here, if we were to take somebody who had 28, the highest level of torture, they would be a 5.6 points. In other words, nearly a 4-point leap on that 7-point scale of support for torture based on your level of racism and holding other variables at specified values. And that, my friends, is how you estimate the value of the dependent variable for different scenarios. And sometimes when you're writing up a paper, just as a final comment, this can be a way to really bring the data alive. You could imagine that if we had partisanship variables in here, we have the gender variable, we have the youth variable, we have the religiosity variable, well, you might be able to say, for example, what is the what's the support for torture on the 1-7 scale if we take somebody who's extremely religious at the highest levels, who is of a typical or average age, so we'd separately run the average for age, create the mean, who is a male Republican, what is their level of support versus a female Democrat 19-year-old who doesn't go to religious services very often. So instead of just having those variables and putting them in a table, sometimes when you're writing up your analysis in a compelling way, it's helpful to think about the people who are most likely, based on your theories, to, in this case, support torture versus those that are not, and you can calculate separate scenario scores for both of them. So again, I will put this handout that walked through the PDF file that showed you how we calculated these online to go with the video, but this is how you calculate a scenario using the basic regression formula.